I was kind of humming and hawing about whether I should go into this in exhaustive detail or not, or do short version of this and just wander through other mental health issues. So I'm still kind of undecided. So I'll probably compress it down some. So basically, this is like the drive-by shooting bullets that get sent my way in the gang war in academia. This is the stuff that skeptical people say about DID. And the main point is, it's just a really, really, really low level of logic and scholarship. I mean, just basic errors of logic, discourse, analysis, that in a philosophy department, you just get laughed out of the department if you did this kind of stuff. So very commonly, arguments are applied to DID that could just as well be used against all their psychiatric disorders. So DID is not real because, and fill in the blank, but the same thing applies to all the other psychiatric disorders, but that's never said about them. So it's this kind of double standard goes on all the time, which I'll give you some examples of. Skeptics also overgeneralize from biased samples. So in cognitive therapy, which is a very well-studied, tons of outcome studies, method of therapy, originally for depression, then expanded to a lot of other stuff. In cognitive therapy, you look for cognitive errors. So people who've been abused as kids always blame themselves. So they think, I'm bad, I'm unworthy, I'm causing it, I deserve it, it's my fault. And then that gets reinforced and ingrained, reinforced and ingrained. 30 years later, they come to our program, I'm bad, I deserved it, I caused it, it's my fault, I deserve to be abused by my husband, I deserve to be abused by myself, I'm not even a member of the human race, I'm a disgrace, etc. All the time, all the time, all the time, all the time. So one of the methods of therapy we apply to this is cognitive therapy. So we look at this as a cognitive error, an incorrect belief, because no child deserves to be abused or causes abuse. So it's an error in thinking. And then we have a whole bunch of strategies and techniques we do to try and get them to see that no, that's not true. It's never true of any human being. You deserve to be treated well. The only reason you weren't was just bad luck. It's all about your parents, not about you. So in the cognitive therapy literature, I'll take a question just in a second, there's some basic sort of categories of cognitive error. There's all or nothing black and white thinking. So that dominates presidential debates. You see this all or nothing black and white thinking. This guy's going to destroy America. This guy's the only hope for America. Such extreme polarized black and white without looking at all the subtleties in between. And it dominates discussion in the culture of all kinds of different issues all the time. But all or nothing black and white thinking is supposed to be typical of borderline personality disorder. So it's a form of mental illness that we treat with psychotherapy. Another cognitive error is catastrophization. So the example I use when I'm teaching at the patient or client is, the woman's upstairs, she's in her bedroom, she's about to go to sleep, all of a sudden she hears a sound downstairs. She thinks to herself, if that dog knocks over his water bowl one more time, I'm really going to be mad at him. Then she goes to sleep. Down the street, there's another woman who's upstairs in her house. She hears exactly the same sound. She goes, I think a serial killer just broke into the house. Okay, so the thinking that you have is going to generate some very different emotional reactions, right? The woman is kind of, go to sleep. The other woman's in full panic. So your thinking kicks up all this fight, flight, catastrophe, adrenaline, and then the counter to that is to de-escalate, talk yourself down. So this is catastrophization. Another cognitive error that mental patients do all the time is overgeneralization. So my uncle abused me, therefore all men are pedophiles. Well, unfortunately, our colleagues do that all the time. They overgeneralize from biased samples. So they might see one case of DID diagnosed by somebody else where there was lousy treatment and the person got worse, and then they conclude that all the treatment is 100% harmful. This happens all the time. DID is not valid because its treatment has not been proven effective. Okay, well, so we just got rid of cancer of the pancreas. There's no effective treatment for cancer of the pancreas, so therefore it's not a valid disorder, right? You can't say this in general medicine Everybody just look at you like, what? But you can say it about DID. So if it was true that the treatment of DID has no evidence base, has never been proven to be helpful, that would tell us zero about whether it's a legitimate disorder or not. Go back 200 years, there's no effective treatments for hardly anything in all of medicine. That doesn't mean all the diseases were not real. So the absence of an effective treatment tells you nothing about the validity of the disorder. But on top of it, there in fact is a bunch of treatment outcome evidence. So that's an example of, you can say that about DID, but you couldn't possibly say it about cancer of the pancreas. Everybody would just think you should have your license removed. Sorry, you were going to ask something?
Yeah, it was when we were talking about childhood abuse. Now, things like, I don't know, like parents divorced or other experiences that, you could qualify as psychological trauma, but
right.
It was not intended. Is that something that you guys keep in count when you guys do your research? Like, oh, we asked this question, were you abused as a child? The person might not think about it as, I was not abused, but there was certain experience that would be considered as trauma.
So this is an excellent question. And of course, it's really complicated. Nobody's got all the answers, because there aren't really any measures that ask about every single kind of upsetting or traumatic thing that can happen. And so the focus is often on physical abuse, sexual abuse, big, obvious, clear stuff. But actually in the patients who come to the program, half the trauma comes from good things that should have happened that didn't. Namely, bonding, connecting, loving, unconditional love, nurturing, protection. And so they felt very scared, small, sad, lost, lonely. But nothing happened. Nobody fired a gun. Nobody hit you. So a lot of trauma is actually things that never even happened. And then there's kind of like mild trauma, and then medium trauma, and obvious huge trauma. And then there's, some people can run faster, some people are better at math, some people are a little tougher at surviving trauma. Maybe two people have the same amount of trauma, but one's got a fairly okay parent and one's got two not okay parents. So the one with the one okay parent got the same amount of sexual abuse, or they had a good aunt, or they had something to counterbalance the effect of the trauma. So there's all these different things that kind of come into play. And measuring it all is like pretty complicated and hard to do. But there's like a recent literature started to grow showing very clearly that childhood bullying has lots of serious mental health consequences. 10 years ago, there was nothing about bullying in the mental health literature. And then divorce, it all depends, because sometimes the amount of family pathology and the amount of trauma goes down because of divorce, because you got rid of the not so good parent. Other times it goes up. So there's not just one pattern. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, yeah, definitely. Makes sense. So you would think that in your field, like, that's probably one good area where more research could build up on, like trying to measure some of these variables. Like,
yeah, absolutely. We always need more research. So of course my opinion is we should take $1 billion from all this genetic research that's going nowhere and put it into this kind of research. Because there isn't an infinite pot of money. And so being able to study all this stuff, we're getting robbed by all the money being diverted over in that direction. You look like you still have another thought there.
No,
okay. So DID is not a disease because it is influenced by culture. So this gets published in psychiatry journals. Okay, so hold on a second here. Wait, so you're telling me that there's actually psychiatric disorders that are not influenced by culture? It's an absurd proposition. Every anthropologist in every anthropology department in the whole planet would laugh his head off at you, or her head. It's ridiculous. There's no culture-free psychiatric disorder at all. So the fact that something is influenced by culture tells you nothing about nothing in terms of the validity of the disorder. But sort of lurking in behind there is this idea that, oh, it's not influenced by culture because it's a biological brain disease. The absence of cases outside North America proves DID is a North American artifact. So we've accumulated lots of cases from outside North America, so that one's starting to kind of drop off now. But let's just say it was a fact. If we go back 30 years, 25 years, there's a lot more cases being diagnosed in North America than outside North America. So what does that prove? Well, there's two competing hypotheses to explain it. So I'm talking about DID here, but I'm actually illustrating kind of the logic of how the mental health system works and what arguments are and how you prove things and disprove things, and which could be applied to all kinds of different disorders. So the two competing hypotheses are, well, it's just being diagnosed more often in North America because the clinicians have become aware of it in North America and everybody else hasn't got up to speed yet. That's one hypothesis. And it's a real legitimate disorder. And if we do research in other countries, we'll find lots of DID all over the place. The second hypothesis is it's just a hysterical fad kicked up by these crazy therapists, one of whom is me. And that's why it doesn't occur outside North America, because they aren't as hysterical in the rest of the world. So the fact that in the 80s, DID was being diagnosed a lot more inside North America was a fact. But it's equally consistent with both hypotheses. But the skeptical people used the fact to prove their theory. But that's not how science works. What you do is you have an observation, a fact, then you construct a theory to explain the fact, and then you have to test your theory to see if it's right or not. You don't just go, well, here's the fact, here's my theory, the fact proves my theory. No scientist operates like that. So what you have to do is do some research and do some studies and find out, okay, are there no cases outside North America? Yes or no? So it's a completely unscientific kind of intellectual function. Increase of diagnosis in DID in the 90s is evidence of its artifactual nature, same idea. Also going back in time, DID was rarely diagnosed in the 19th century. That proves it's just a fad in the 20th century, which is unfortunately persisting into the 21st century. But it's the same two theories. It's always been around, going back for thousands of years. We just haven't gotten up to speed on it until into the 20th century, versus no, we created a fad in the 20th century. So the fact that there's more cases diagnosed 1980 to 90 than all of the 18th and 19th centuries doesn't prove which theory is correct. But the skeptics use the fact to prove their own theory. Skeptics make appeals to authority. So appeal to authority is, by the way, I know this is true because Freud said so. Right? So you just, Freud, can't argue with Freud. That's an appeal to authority. Or if you're a philosopher, Wittgenstein said so. Or if you're an English literature person, you might say something about Dickens. So the skeptics prove that they're correct by referencing their friends and their co-authors over and over and over and over and over. So there's a little group of guys who belong to the club, and everybody in the club agrees, therefore the club is correct. It's just not science. Validity can be inferred from anecdotal short-term treatment outcome, which I measured before, talked about before. So if you find a couple of cases that did poorly, you can then conclude that all treatment of all cases of DID is bad and wrong. You couldn't say this about schizophrenia. You know, a couple of people with schizophrenia came to the hospital and they got some sort of crazy treatment and they did badly, therefore schizophrenia is not real. You just cannot say that anywhere in the mental health field. But you can say it about DID. Bad therapeutic practices call the validity of DID into question. Okay, so you go to Mexico to get Lyotril for cancer and you die at exactly the same date as you would have if you didn't go to Mexico, proving that cancer is not real. It just doesn't make any sense. Diagnostic criteria for DID are vague, or DID is not valid. Okay, that could be true if it was true that the diagnostic criteria are vague. But how are we going to find out if the diagnostic criteria are vague? Well, we got to do inter-rater reliability studies and look at the Cohen's kappa. So we actually have evidence that the criteria for DID are less vague, like the DID, it's depending if you want to go up or down on the scale. Either the criteria for depression are twice as vague as the criteria for DID, or the criteria for DID are half as vague as the depression criteria based on the Cohen's-Kappes. So why are we saying that DID is vague when it's actually demonstrably much less vague than depression? And what is the, how do you diagnose substance abuse according to the DSM-5? Well, obviously got to take a bunch of some kind of substances, but you have to, all the wording is things like clinically significant. So what's clinically significant? There's no number for that. It's kind of a vague term. To be depressed, you have to be depressed, down, sad, blue, most of the time for at least 2 weeks. Yeah, but how much most of the time? It's completely undefined. It's literally just most of the time. So this is one of the reasons why the agreement level is so low. So we're applying this argument of vagueness to DID, which applies more to other diagnoses. Lack of proven physiological differences between alters invalidates DID. There's no proven physiological difference between any mental disorder and any other mental disorder. So this applies to all mental disorders. We don't have, and this is according to DSM-5, we don't have a blood test, we don't have a brain scan for diagnosing any DSM disorder. If repression is not proven, DID is not real. Did that earlier. Diagnosis of DID encourages irresponsible behavior. It could. It doesn't in my treatment programs. I hold people with DID responsible for all their behavior, and they get the natural consequences of their behavior just like anybody without DID. So you can use DID to go, oh, they can't help it, little Joey inside did it, but you don't have to. So if we had a rule in the mental health system that if you're depressed, you get half as long a prison sentence as somebody who's not depressed, how many people would be depressed all the time? Everybody. If we had a rule that said depressed people get double the sentence, everybody would be, I'm not depressed, right? So you can totally manipulate it by the rules of the system. It's not inherent in the disorder or the diagnosis. The religious borderlines went over that. It's an artifact of suggestibility and highly hypnotizable individuals. So this is one of the common things. You just hypnotize these people and suggest to them that they have a canary living in their left ear, and all of a sudden they have a canary living in their left ear. It's a very chauvinistic, demeaning, belittling view of women, because most of the people in treatment are women, that they're so impressionable. You just tell them, oh, you have somebody inside. Oh, yes, I have somebody inside. I mean, it's like women don't even know their own minds. It's a very belittling model. And we actually have all kinds of research. People with DID who have never been hypnotized don't really differ in their symptom profiles from people who have been hypnotized. It's impossible to have more than one personality in the same body. Therefore, it's not a real disorder. Well, of course it's impossible to have more than one personality in the same body. Nobody's saying there's literally different people living in there. And I explain this to patients all the time. I call it the central paradox of DID. So it took a while to figure this out, because if you say this the wrong way, the person goes, oh, you're telling me it's not real, I'm just making it up, it's all in my head, I might as well go kill myself right now. So you got to be careful how you deliver it. So it took me a while to figure out how to state the central paradox of DID, which is it's both real and not real at the same time. And I've given this explanation to hundreds and hundreds of people with DID. What do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, it's not literally concretely real. So if we took an X-ray of your head, we wouldn't see all these little skeletons in there. And if there really were little skeletons running around inside your brain would be just all mashed up and you'd be dead. And nobody goes, oh yeah, there's skeletons in there. Everybody goes, oh, that's cute, little skeletons. So nobody debates the point. So it's not literally concretely true, separate people, personalities in there. But on the other hand, it's completely psychologically true and very subjectively compelling. And people really do open up their closets, and there's like 3 outfits. So this was a very conservative 39-year-old married housewife, and there's like 16-year-old party girl stuff. She doesn't remember buying it. There's the receipt, her credit card, sort of like her signature, and she can't remember from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. yesterday because her teenage alter went shopping. These experiences actually happen. They're very psychologically real. They're just not literally real. So this whole thing about it's not possible to have more than one personality is like completely irrelevant. A few clinicians are making all the diagnoses. That was true in 1980. It's not true today, but so what? At one point in time, a small number of clinicians were making all the AIDS diagnoses. What does that prove? There's people who have clinics every week where numerous people with cystic fibrosis come to see them. And there's other pediatricians who don't see any cases at all. Well, that's because these guys specialize in cystic fibrosis. It's completely ordinary. It's unsurprising. Nobody says, oh, a few clinicians are seeing most of the cases of this disorder, therefore it's not real. They just go, oh, those guys specialize in that. Incorrect references are indicative of careless research in the skeptical literature. So the skeptical guys do a really lousy job on their references. They even get the wrong references. Or they quote a reference supporting a point that doesn't even support that point. So just lousy scholarship. DID has been created experimentally, which proves it's not valid. Okay. So there's nothing worse in medicine than having an animal model of a disorder, right? So biological cancer researchers never want to study mice that have cancer. Well, of course they do. These are called animal models. All of medicine is based on things in test tubes and things in animals that are a model of the disease in humans so we can study how it works, whether it's the immune system or arthritis or cancer. So animal models or experimental models of something don't disprove it. They help us to study how it works. So nowhere else in medicine is an experimental version of the disorder used to invalidate the disorder. What are the experiments where people created DID that proves it's not valid? It's so preposterous. You wouldn't believe that this stuff could get in the literature if it wasn't in almost all of the major psychology textbooks as evidence that DID is not valid. So the experiment is you get a whole bunch of undergraduates, such as you guys. I bring you in. I give you a little bit of training for an hour or two about what DID is, what it looks like. I teach you about child-altered personalities. And then I ask you to come back next week and act as if you have multiple personality, and a little girl comes out and talks and she's so cute and she doesn't remember what happened a long time ago. So you do that. The reason you do that is you get course credit for it. And this is the proof that multiple personality can be created experimentally. Literally, they get college students to act as if they have multiple personality after they give them a little training on how to do the acting. That's it. Do any of these people have multiple personality for another year? Or go to the counseling center and say, I can't remember what happened yesterday? None. So what if we got you guys together and we said, okay, I'm going to teach you about back pain. You're all going to act like you got lumbar disc pain, and you're going to be going, oh, and you're going to ask the doctor for some painkillers, and maybe you need to take a week off of school, and you can't hand in your paper this week. And so you all start going, oh. This proves that disc pain isn't a real thing. So teaching people to fake something temporarily in order to get course credit, it tells us nothing about whether the thing they're faking actually happens in the world or not. But I'm not kidding, like the majority of undergraduate psychology textbooks cite these experiments as compelling, conclusive evidence that DID is a fake disorder. Which again, if you did that with depression, everybody just go, well, they're just faking depression. They don't actually have it. It stops as soon as the experiment's over.
What about Bluebird? Reference to being
This guy's read too many of my books here for his own good. So another line of argument, which I was not going to get into, but it's a whole another half-day talk, is one of my books. Originally it was called Bluebird, but I reissued it as The CIA Doctors. It's about 15,000 pages of documents that were declassified in the 70s, plus a ton of papers from medical journals from the 50s and 60s about CIA mind control experimentation, all totally documented, done at major institutions, Ivy League schools. Closest place where MK Ultra top secret experimentation was done to here would be Ionia State Hospital in Michigan. The experiment there was 5 or 6 military psychiatrists who had served in the Vietnam War, who are now back working at the State Mental Hospital in Michigan, cleared at top secret by the CIA, knowing it was CIA funding, were interviewing incarcerated sex offenders and giving them barbiturates, marijuana, and hallucinogens to see if they could get them to confess to crimes they'd never been charged with. That seems a little dicey. I don't think that would exactly pass the proper ethical review board. You've got incarcerated sex offenders, you're giving them street drugs to see if you can get them to confess to things, and then you're not going to bother reporting that to the police at all. And it's cleared at top secret. So these are the documented types of experiments that were done, including creating Manchurian candidates, which is artificial multiple personality, which is the movie The Manchurian Candidate. This is fact, not fiction, described extensively in documents. That if you take somebody, you don't just go, hey, it's the same as creating a suicide bomber. You don't just walk up to somebody on the street and go, hey, would you like to blow yourself up next week? You got to recruit them, you got to work on them, you got to soften up a little, you got to give them some rewards. 72 virgins in heaven, pretty good reward. Not sure if it's a real reward. So to get somebody to kill themselves, I mean, it's a project. You got to have a susceptible person, and you can't choose like the head of the government's son. And they got to be kind of desperate, and they got to be kind of adrift in life, and then you got to work on them, work on them, work on them. If you take somebody such as a Marine, and you work on them for a period of months with all kinds of interrogation techniques and brainwashing techniques, you can create artificial multiple personality and use the person in the background to go on missions, and the person out front doesn't remember. And this is described in great detail in documents going back to the Second World War. So what I do with that is I say, that proves the reality of civilian clinical multiple personality. If you control somebody, traumatize them, threaten them, manipulate them enough, this is how the human mind reacts. Not in all people, but a subgroup of people. So if you react to brainwashing by creating a new alter personality, why wouldn't you react to child abuse by creating a new alter personality? DID must be completely unconscious to be genuine. I don't know where these guys even came up with this. They say that people like me believe that DID is totally unconscious. Nobody in the DID field has ever said that. They just kind of invent that out of nowhere. And then they argue that, well, since it's not completely unconscious, it's not genuine, which doesn't make any sense. Whoever comes in and says, I'm here, doctor, because I'm completely unconscious of being depressed. It just didn't make any sense. Satanic ritual abuse and alien abduction are not real, so neither is DID. Okay, so wait a minute. What's that got to do with anything? Only 2 or 3 people with DID who describe alien abduction experiences out of thousands. So a few people with schizophrenia think they were abducted by aliens, therefore schizophrenia is not real? It just, again, absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. Satanic ritual abuse, well, let's assume that all the satanic ritual abuse memories, which is a subgroup of people with DID, are not real. Okay, so hello, these people are psychiatric patients in a mental hospital. They're a little mixed up. Who's surprised by that? Nobody says, oh, these schizophrenics have delusions, therefore their schizophrenia isn't real. They just, over and over and over, this logic just doesn't make any sense. And then the extreme case escalation tactic is just a term I invented. So they'll take the most extreme out there case and use that to be typical of the entire population of DID. And so they'll always do that, escalate up to the extreme situation. So if you go to I don't know the exact percentage, but over 3/4 of undergrad or even graduate abnormal psychology textbooks, you'll get the anti-DID approach, and you'll hear them talking about the Hillside Strangler case in Los Angeles in the 1970s, which is a serial killer who's convicted, who, not 100% for sure, but probably was faking DID. And that is overwhelming, powerful evidence that DID is not a legitimate disorder. One case of one guy who's a serial killer, we're going to rely on them, who tried to get out of responsibility by faking DID proves what about everybody else? It's just so far in outer space, it's hard to believe, but it's in the majority of abnormal psychology textbooks as powerful evidence that DID is not real. Textbooks written by like the top professors. This is what I deal with. Okay, so this is now my favorite part of the whole thing. So this book was not published that long ago. Well, let me skip that one, sorry. I'm just gonna, because we're a little short on time. Here we are at my favorite one. So this book was not published all that long ago. Sybil Exposed, by this woman, Debbie Nathan, who sees herself as a feminist. She's a journalist. And SHIRLEY MASON is the real person who was in the novel and the movie Sybil. So the two big books and novels before DSM-3 came out in 1980, where multiple personality got an official slot, the two big books and movies were The Three Faces of Eve and Sybil. And Chris Sizemore, who's the real Eve from The Three Faces of Eve, I know personally, amazing woman, has been integrated since 1975, highly gifted artist, wonderful person, has been well for decades. SHIRLEY MASON, who's Sybil, I never met and she died. But in this book, this Debbie Nathan uses the Sybil case to establish conclusively that Sybil really didn't have DID. It was just a crazy therapist, Cornelia Wilbur, which then makes us know pretty well for sure that all the cases are ridiculous and not real. But let's look at her analysis here. This is all from her book. So, she's born in 1923, died in 1998. She had 5 sessions with Dr. Cornelia Wilbur, who I knew, who is now deceased, in 1945. So 5 sessions. She functioned well with no signs of DID from 1945 until she started seeing her again in 1954. So these are the facts according to Debbie Nathan. The symptoms of DID began after the therapy restarted and were caused by the bad therapy by Cornelia Wilbur. Okay, but in the book, Debbie Nathan describes symptoms prior to first contact with Dr. Wilbur, described to her by many people in SHIRLEY MASON's hometown who she interviewed directly. Many different people, family members and non-family members. The symptoms from before first contact included fugue states, which means going somewhere and not remembering who you are for a period of time. Blank spells, so clearly defined chunks of missing time. Spending hours playing with imaginary companions with names far beyond the age that this occurs in non-traumatized children, pretending to be Vicky, one of her imaginary companions at time, her mother calling her by the names of alter personalities later identified in adult therapy, talking in a high childish voice when she was no longer a child, numerous symptoms consistent with somatoform dissociation, which means psychosomatic symptoms, going to bars to drink with men and not remembering afterwards, although she hadn't consumed that much alcohol, suddenly going comatose in public, suddenly acting dramatically out of character. All of these behaviors, described by many observers in her hometown, going back into her childhood for years before first contact with Cornelia Wilbur, yet the analysis is all the DID symptoms were caused by the therapy. This is huge amount of symptomatology consistent with pre-existing DID. But then she goes on to say that all these symptoms that existed before contact with Cornelia Wilbur were caused by pernicious anemia, a form of anemia. Well, a little minor problem. She never had a pernicious anemia diagnosis. No doctor ever diagnosed her with that. It's just made up out of nowhere. if the symptoms were caused by pernicious anemia, which she didn't have, why did those symptoms go into remission from 1945 to 1954? So Debbie Nathan says she had all these symptoms here before seeing Cornelia Wilbur, caused by pernicious anemia, which doesn't cause those symptoms anyway, and which she didn't have. And then all those symptoms stopped for 9 years, although she wasn't diagnosed or treated, and pernicious anemia never goes away. And then they suddenly started up again and were caused by Cornelia Wilbur. Like, who's going to believe this? This book gets published, gets reviewed favorably all over the place. It's cited by all the skeptics. It'll be in the psychology textbooks soon. Debbie Nathan wrote this compelling analysis. And the final nail in the coffin of DID is that Debbie Nathan points out that Shirley Mason denied having MPD herself. Once in one letter. Okay, so you treat somebody with chronic severe alcoholism for a long period of time, and once they write you a letter saying that they don't have a drinking problem, that's it. They clearly don't have a drinking problem. It's just, again, it's just this outer space Mad Hatter's Tea Party. It doesn't make any sense. It's impossible. It's so far below any kind of high school debating clubs do way better than this in their level of scholarship, argument, weighing the evidence. So then that raises the question, well, why? Why is this all going on in the field? What's the deal here? Why do all these like high-ranking professors have all this bad attitude and all these crazy arguments that make no sense? And my answer is I don't know for sure. But I think there's multiple sort of factors contributing to this. One is my professors never taught me about that. I was taught that it's rare. My professors can't be wrong. I can't be wrong. It'd be too shameful to admit that we've all been wrong for all these decades. So there's just sort of egotism, professional reputation. Another thing is if it's actually true that in the ballpark of 1 out of 25 inpatients in all the psych hospitals in the country has undiagnosed DID, and we're missing all those cases, that doesn't make us look like very sharp diagnosticians. So therefore we have to say it's not real. Another thing is if there's all these people with DID, full DID, plus a whole bunch of people with kind of half, 3/4, a quarter DID, maybe a lot of us are a little more DID-ish than we would like to admit to. So maybe I don't want to look at them because I don't want to have to look at myself. Maybe my behavior is sometimes a little inconsistent and doesn't exactly mesh together in a healthy fashion, which doesn't mean that I have DID. I'm talking, the skeptic. Maybe I, the skeptic, have an unresolved childhood trauma history and I don't want anybody talking about that stuff. So therefore, when Colin Ross goes to the American College of Psychiatrists meeting, here's a whole hour talk by a top expert on childhood depression, not a mention of childhood abuse of any kind once. Then listens to another talk about another expert, not a mention of childhood trauma once. Another talk by another expert, still no mention of childhood trauma. Maybe they just don't want to talk about it. Maybe they're uncomfortable. Maybe it's something to do with personal histories. Next hypothesis. I remember when sexual abuse was just kind of coming out of the closet. In 1980, the third edition of the Comprehensive Textbook of Psychiatry was published that I used in my residency from 81 to 85. There's 3 volumes. It's 3,300 and something pages, 2 columns each page. Everything you need to know in psychiatry was in there. Way at the back, after the important stuff like depression, schizophrenia, drugs, genetics, was a section called Topics of Special Interest, which really means irrelevant stuff that we just stuck in at the end because, you know, got to be comprehensive. In there was a short chapter called Incest. In the chapter on incest was 1 paragraph talking about how common incest is, with a reference to a 1955 study saying it's 1 family out of 1 million in the United States. Those were the scientific, academic, medical facts during my training. That's the level of denial. Institutional denial that's been in place in psychiatry for a century. It's actually more than one family out of 100, not one out of 1,000,000. In this same era, in the mid-'80s, there's several surveys where, surprisingly, female psychiatrists got interested in childhood sexual abuse, which is mostly, but not exclusively, girls. It's about 2 to 3 times as much with girls as with boys. And they did mail-out surveys to different types of physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, and I think in one survey, social workers, can't remember for sure, but all different types of physicians. Have you ever had sex with somebody who's currently in treatment with you? And a bunch of other questions. They got back, they described in their article, published in a leading journal, angry, scrawling, F-bombs and the whole works from physicians, swearing at them, accusing of being this, that, and the other, and not filling out the questionnaire. And 10% of respondents said yes, anonymous respondents said, yes, I have had sex with somebody who's currently in treatment with me in my practice. So 10% admitted. So what do we think the real rate is? So do we think there's pedophiles in the Catholic Church? Do we think there's any in the Boy Scouts? Do we think there's any in the medical profession? Do we think there's any in psychiatry? There has to be. There's pedophiles everywhere. So part of the whole deal is pedophiles don't want anybody talking about this stuff. Then the other part of it is biological brain disease model. If the genetics and the biology of the brain are the major drivers of mental illness, we can't allow it to be true that childhood trauma that's the major driver. It's just not allowed. So you have to discredit it, and any diagnoses that are linked to it, discredit. So to me, that's what's going on in the profession. You look like you had a question.
Yeah. Approximately, what's the ratio of skeptics to clinicians who believe in DID?
There's actually surveys by skeptics, funnily enough, who then conclude that DID is not valid, should be taken out of the DSM. And in those surveys about, it's a little tricky how they word the question. So sometimes the question is, should the criteria be modified? And the answer is yes. And then they say, well, see, it's a bogus diagnosis. Well, hello, the criteria for schizophrenia just got modified between DSM-4 and DSM-5. So, of course, we have to fine-tune stuff, and that proves nothing. But it comes out about bouncing around from survey to survey. Hardcore skeptics are somewhere in the between 5 and 15%. Half to 2/3 think it's a legitimate disorder, needs more research, maybe needs some fine-tuning, sometimes questionable. That's kind of the ballpark. So, but the very small group of really vociferous, I mean, they're like the jihadists, right? They're the anti-DID jihadists. They're very vocal, very energized, very active, and have control of undergrad psychology textbooks by and large.
What about the actual literature? Sorry, the actual literature. Is there like a lot of literature? You presented us with all the literature you've done on this topic. Like, is there like a lot of literature that says the opposite of what you're saying?
Well, the literature that says the opposite just says it, but doesn't have any evidence. So these guys, like the guys who do the experiments to create multiple personality in college students, they never once describe interviewing a single person with a clinical diagnosis of DID. So they do no treatment, and they don't even talk to people to say, hey, tell me about your experience here. So it's totally armchair quarterbacks. And they don't have any solid, designed research studies proving any of their points.
So there's not that many like actual empirical research from their side. It's mostly just reviews of
reviews and opinions,
okay.
yeah. And false reasoning.
All right.
Yep.
And sometimes stereotyped but inaccurate descriptions of what they're even rejecting.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we were talking about this before. So the stereotype of what somebody with DID is supposed to look like. So they're like flamboyantly extremely obvious. They're right in your face with it. They're claiming no responsibility for anything. They're trying to get all kinds of special treatment and privileges. and there's no evidence for any DID before from anywhere. That's the stereotype, which simply is just not reality. Of course, we know that everybody from Grand Rapids is actually a Martian wearing a human costume. Well, we don't really have evidence for that, but we know it's true. And it's kind of like that. Anybody else with a thought, comment, question about anything in the mental health field? Or anything to do with college hockey that I know a lot about?
College hockey.
Okay, well, thanks for listening. Thanks for spending some time.
My interest in this has been the harm that multiple personality caused in the criminal justice system and in the culture. The idea that women are so weak that we can't remember things that have happened to us, that we have to go back in order to sort of be well, in order to be whole, to feel whole. We have to blame someone. We have to go back and find things in our childhood, find a horrible victimization. I don't think that does women a lot of good. And at the same time, I find it really interesting that we're so fascinated by that idea. We're so drawn to that idea. That's sort of what pushed me through 3 years of research and into the writing of Sybil Exposed. I mean, most psychiatrists and psychologists at this point don't diagnose multiple personality disorder, but there are enough of them that still do. It remains in the DSM, and it would take a movement to remove it. And I can't tell you why that hasn't happened. I have heard that my book has had some influence, that there's a lot of discussion now because of my book.